Why was this book hidden? Who feared what it revealed? And if it was truly dangerous, dangerous to whom? Tonight, we step into one of the oldest shadows around the Bible, the Book of Jubilees, a text that retells sacred history with a different rhythm, a different calendar, and a different warning. Some call it forbidden knowledge, others call it a witness from a forgotten stream of Jewish faith. Either way, it raises a hard question that still unsettles believers and skeptics alike. When a book is pushed to the margins, are we seeing protection of truth or protection of power? But here's the thing. The story of Jubilees is less about conspiracy and more about collision. Tradition meets tradition. Priestly time meets temple time. Memory meets canon. In this episode, our thesis is simple. The Book of Jubilees was not merely banned for being strange, but sidelined because its worldview challenged dominant religious authority, sacred chronology, and accepted boundaries of revelation. And our path is clear. We begin with Moses and the Sinai revelation, as Jubilees frames it, then enter the dark aftermath of the Watchers and human corruption, then confront the calendar conflict between Jubilees and temple practice, and finally ask why this book was excluded from most biblical canons while preserved in others. We are not chasing sensational certainty. We are following evidence, language, and historical context with caution, where the record is debated. Jubilees likely emerged in the Second Temple period, often dated to the 2nd century BCE, and it presents itself as revelation given to Moses on Sinai through an angelic mediator. That framing matters because it gives the text a voice of divine order, not casual commentary. It rewrites Genesis and part of Exodus into cycles of jubilees and weeks, turning history into measured sacred time. Then comes its darker edge, the memory of rebellious heavenly beings, corruption spreading through humanity, and judgment as a response to cosmic disorder. These themes overlap with other ancient Jewish texts, including Enochic traditions, but Jubilees binds them to covenant obedience, purity boundaries, and a strict sense of appointed times. And that is where pressure builds. Jubilees defends a 364-day solar framework tied to holy order, while other communities followed lunar-solar calculations. A calendar is never just math. It decides when festivals happen, who is obedient, who is out of step, and who holds authority to define worship. If your feast day is different, your identity is different. If your sacred clock is different, your priesthood can be questioned. Here's what most people miss. Many disputes that look theological are also disputes about power, practice, and communal survival. So was Jubilees banned? The word can be too blunt. In many traditions, it was not formally condemned line by line, but gradually left outside the canon as rabbinic and later Christian boundaries hardened. Yet it survived, especially in the Ethiopian Christian tradition, where it remained scripture. That survival is its own testimony. Not every excluded book is poison. Not every preserved book is harmless. Sometimes a text endures because it speaks to a community that still hears its warning. As we move forward, keep one question alive. If holiness is measured by the calendar, by memory, and by obedience, what happens when different communities claim different clocks from the same God? We are going to walk that tension carefully, in the dark, with open eyes. If Jubilees speaks in the voice of Sinai, what exactly is it asking us to trust? Is it preserving an ancient memory or constructing a theological boundary in sacred language? The book presents itself as revelation delivered to Moses on the mountain through an angelic mediator, and that claim is not decorative. It is authority by design. It tells the listener, this is not a later opinion, this is heaven's ordering of history. And when a text claims that kind of weight, the stakes change immediately. You are no longer debating style. You are debating who gets to define truth, who gets to set the rhythm of worship, and who has the right to say what counts as faithful memory. In many surviving manuscripts and traditions, Jubilees retells material we know from Genesis and Exodus, but it does so with a strict architecture of time, numbered cycles, appointed periods, and covenantal boundaries. Why retell familiar stories in a different structure unless structure itself is the message? That is the pressure point. Jubilees does not simply repeat origins, it reorganizes origins, it measures them, it filters them through the conviction that sacred history must be guarded from drift. When memory becomes measured time, interpretation becomes discipline, and discipline always creates insiders and outsiders. If your reading of the past differs, your practice in the present differs. If your practice differs, your belonging can be questioned. This is where our central dilemma starts to sharpen. Was Jubilees sidelined because it was too strange, or because it was too strong in the wrong direction? In other words, was exclusion a defense of truth or a defense of authority? The Sinai framing in Jubilees asks us to confront that question head-on. A text claiming Mosaic revelation could unify a community, but it could also destabilize already forming interpretive leadership. If one circle says, "This is the authentic order given at Sinai," and another says, "No, that claim overreaches," the conflict is not only about manuscripts, it is about governance of conscience. There is also a pastoral edge hidden in this first block. People do not fear ancient books only because of wild stories. They fear what those books might require. If sacred time is fixed, if obedience is mapped, if covenant life is measured, then compromise becomes harder. That is uncomfortable in any generation. So when we hear that a text was forbidden, we should slow down. Sometimes forbidden means dangerous error. Sometimes it means dangerous challenge. Sometimes it means both, depending on who is speaking. And as the mountain scene fades, another shadow enters the frame, one that makes the stakes darker and more urgent. What happens when heavenly rebellion leaks into human life? Why does Jubilees place corruption not just in politics, but in a cosmic fracture that begins above and descends below? Here we move into the Watcher's tradition, where rebellious beings cross boundaries and disorder spreads among humans. Similar motifs appear in Enochic literature, yet Jubilees uses the material with a different emphasis. The fascination is not spectacle. The concern is contamination of covenant order. Knowledge itself can become disordered when it is detached from obedience. Power can become violence when it is detached from holiness. Notice the contrast. In popular retellings, the Watcher's story is often reduced to monsters, forbidden secrets, and apocalyptic drama. In Jubilees, the deeper movement is moral architecture. Corruption is not random chaos. It follows broken boundaries. Heaven trespasses, humanity imitates, violence multiplies, judgment follows. The sequence reads like theology, but it also functions like social warning. If people normalize what should remain outside covenant life, collapse begins slowly, then suddenly. Is that literal history, symbolic memory, a fusion of both? The text does not pause to answer modern categories. It presses toward responsibility. And this is exactly why the Watcher's material matters for our thesis. A community that sees itself as guarding purity can use these stories to enforce discipline. A rival community can view the same stories as speculative, destabilizing, or excessive. So again, we face the same axis of tension: truth protection or power protection. Maybe the harder answer is that institutions often experience the two as inseparable. Leaders may sincerely believe they are preserving doctrine while also preserving their authority to define doctrine. Jubilees becomes threatening not because it is merely dark, but because it binds cosmic rebellion to practical obedience in ways that challenge competing frameworks. Here is the quiet pastoral warning. Not every hidden teaching is holy, And not every rejected teaching is false. Discernment is costly. Curiosity without humility can become vanity. Authority without humility can become control. So when we step through this material, we do it with caution, not thrill-seeking, because the point is not to romanticize darkness. The point is to understand how communities decide what darkness means, and that decision, more than any single mythic detail, leads us to the next battlefield, the calendar itself. Could a calendar really divide the faithful? Could counting days become a test of covenant loyalty? It sounds technical until you realize what a calendar governs. Festivals, fasts, priestly rotations, public memory, shared identity. Jubilees is associated with a 364-day solar framework tied to ordered sacred time, while other Jewish groups in the Second Temple world used lunar solar systems. At first glance, this appears as a practical disagreement. In reality, it can become a direct conflict over who worships at the right time before God. Think about the lived consequences. If one community celebrates a feast while another waits, each sees the other as misaligned. If priestly cycles no longer match, legitimacy fractures. If legitimacy fractures, authority splinters. A calendar dispute then becomes a dispute about revelation itself. Who received the true pattern? Who preserved it faithfully? Who altered it? In that light, Jubilees is not arguing over arithmetic. It is arguing that sacred order is measurable and that mismeasuring time is a form of spiritual disorder. That claim is powerful, and power attracts resistance. Here's what most people miss. Timekeeping is governance. Whoever names the holy day effectively names the shape of the community. So when Jubilees insists on structured cycles and appointed times, it is not merely offering a devotional preference. It is making a jurisdictional claim over covenant life, and jurisdictional claims rarely remain peaceful for long. Even if all sides invoke Scripture, they do not invoke it with equal implications. One reading may allow flexibility and adaptation, another may demand strict continuity with an idealized original order. Which one survives often depends on institutions, not only arguments. At this point, our main question grows sharper still. If Jubilees challenged prevailing religious calendars and linked that challenge to angelic revelation and moral purity, did later exclusion reflect concern for doctrinal reliability, concern for communal stability, or both at once? The documentary record suggests complexity, not a single dramatic moment. Boundaries of canon developed over centuries through layered debates, liturgical habits, linguistic transmission, and communal self-definition. In that process, texts with strong alternative frameworks could lose normative status even when they retained influence at the margins, and yet margins are never empty. The Ethiopian Christian tradition preserved Jubilees as scripture, demonstrating that exclusion in one stream does not equal disappearance everywhere. Survival itself is evidence that the book met real theological needs in at least some communities. It offered a coherent moral cosmos, a disciplined chronology, and an integrated reading of covenant history. So the question is no longer, did everyone accept it? Clearly not. The question becomes, why did some communities continue to hear divine order in it, while others heard risk? That contrast sets up the final movement, where canon, memory, and authority collide directly. Was Jubilees banned? The term is dramatic, but reality appears more gradual. In many Jewish and Christian contexts, the text was not universally denounced in one formal act. It stood outside the canon lists that gained normative force, while other texts became liturgically central. Over time, what is not read publicly becomes less familiar. What is less familiar becomes suspect. What becomes suspect is easier to dismiss as fringe. This is how memory can narrow without a single courtroom verdict. Exclusion can be procedural, cumulative, and quiet. But quiet does not mean neutral. Canon formation is spiritual and communal work, yet it also reflects historical pressures, identity consolidation, doctrinal disputes, language shifts, geographic separation, and institutional continuity. A text like Jubilees, with its assertive claims about revealed time and covenant boundaries, could be judged incompatible with emerging norms. That judgment may have been sincere, strategic, or mixed. Institutions are human. They rarely operate from one motive alone. The same act can preserve truth for one group and preserve control for another. The same boundary can protect devotion and restrict imagination at once. So where do we land? Not in cynicism and not in naive certainty. The strongest reading is that Jubilees was marginalized because it pressed too hard on contested fault lines. Who interprets Sinai, who defines corruption, who sets sacred time, and who decides canon? That does not automatically validate every claim in the book. It does explain why the book remains spiritually potent and institutionally problematic. The conflict was theological, yes, but also structural. Doctrine and power were braided together, and each side likely believed it was defending the community's future. If that conclusion feels unsettling, it should. We often want a cleaner story, heroes guarding orthodoxy or villains suppressing truth. History rarely cooperates. More often we find communities trying to survive, worship faithfully, and maintain order under pressure while disagreeing deeply about the shape of revelation. Jubilees stands inside that struggle like a shard of ancient glass. It refracts the light differently, and because it refracts differently, it was both treasured and resisted. So listen to the tension one more time. A book claims Sinai authority. It warns through the memory of angelic rebellion. It demands a disciplined, sacred calendar. It survives in one canon and recedes in many others. Was it cast out because it distorted truth, or because it threatened established custodians of truth? The episode's answer is careful but firm. Its exclusion reflects a battle over theological legitimacy and communal power together, not one without the other. And now the final question waits at the threshold. If two communities claim devotion to the same God but keep different sacred clocks, whose obedience is recognized, and by whom? That is where our story must go next, from ancient canon debates to the believer's present dilemma, where authority, conscience, and memory still compete for the final word. So where does this leave us after walking through Sinai, the Watchers, the calendar dispute, and the long shadow of canon? It leaves us with three hard takeaways that refuse to stay in the ancient world. The Book of Jubilees is not merely a strange appendix to biblical imagination. It is a full theological system that links revelation, time, obedience, and identity. By presenting itself as instruction given to Moses through an angelic mediator, it claims not just to comment on covenant life, but to regulate it. That claim alone helps explain why the text carried weight for some communities and raised alarms for others. The central issue was never only whether the stories were dramatic. The issue was who had authority to name those stories as binding truth. Second, the darker elements were never just about fear. The Watchers and corruption traditions function as moral architecture. In Jubilees, disorder begins when boundaries collapse, then spreads from the cosmic to the communal. Whether one reads those passages as literal memory, symbolic warning, or a layered combination, the effect is the same. Knowledge without covenant can become ruin. That is why the book does not treat evil as abstract philosophy. It treats evil as misalignment with divine order, then ties that misalignment to concrete life, purity, worship, and judgment. Third, the calendar conflict reveals the deepest fault line. A sacred calendar is not a minor technical preference. It determines feast rhythms, priestly legitimacy, and the social clock of faith. If Jubilees preserves a 364-day framework, while other authorities follow different systems, then disagreement over days becomes disagreement over obedience itself. At that point, canon boundaries are not neutral filing decisions. They become acts of communal definition. Who belongs? Who leads? Who decides what counts as faithful continuity? And this is why our main question still stands in the dark, waiting. Was Jubilees pushed aside to protect doctrine, or because its integrated worldview threatened established religious authority? The most careful answer is not simplistic. Historical evidence for a single, universal moment of ban is limited. The process appears gradual, uneven, and tradition-specific. Yet gradual does not mean accidental. Over time, communities normalized some voices and marginalized others, often while believing they were preserving truth. In that process, theology and power moved together, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in tension, rarely in isolation. That tension should make us humble. It warns us against easy heroes and easy villains. Communities guarding orthodoxy can act with sincerity and still narrow the range of acceptable memory. Communities preserving alternative texts can safeguard valuable witness and still overstate certainty. History gives us fewer clean verdicts than we want, but it gives us patterns. When a text reorganizes sacred time, reframes corruption, and claims high revelation, institutions will test it, resist it, or absorb it. Jubilees was tested, resisted, and partially preserved. So what do we do with that now? We read with caution. We separate established evidence from confident speculation. We honor the canon we inherit without pretending the road to that canon was frictionless. And we refuse the lazy thrill of forbidden content mythology when the real story is far more demanding. The real story is about discernment, authority, and the cost of defining holiness in public. Here is the brief pastoral note this journey leaves behind. Truth does not fear careful questions, and faithful questions do not require rebellious hearts. If we seek light, we can walk slowly, test what we hear, and keep both conviction and humility in the same hand. If this episode helped you see Jubilees with clearer eyes, leave your verdict in one sentence below. Next time, we enter another contested text where the line between revelation and control becomes even harder to trace. And the final question may be this: when memory and authority collide, which one do believers actually obey? Based on what we uncovered together in today's episode, answer this in the comments. Do you think Jubilees was excluded to protect truth or to preserve institutional control? And as always, God bless you.